Welcome to week 11. We're in the home stretch. We've gone through a majority, if not all of the big pre-market submission type activities that we'll have in a facility. And now we're just getting to the tail end of some small administrative pieces that we need to work on that involve pre-market submissions. And two of those will be touched on today, one of them very lightly and the other more detailed. The more detailed one will be claims notification, looking at health claims, structure function claims, claim notifications for dietary supplements, and then wrapping up with the registration process. So when we think about labeling, it may not all involve claims. It may involve ingredient listings, some other technical components about fact panels and net weight, and some of the ingredients that we add to our products as we got into with GROS, the food additive petitions, color additive petitions, really are there to have some other technical effect that the consumer may not even be aware of and doesn't need communication on the label other than disclosure that it's present in the food product. Preservatives, stabilizers, emulsifiers, all of those sort of things that don't have a benefit. Colors, for example, typically are just there for commercial appeal and not necessarily there for a health or some other benefit. So, allergens are probably one area where we have disclosure, but we don't have to necessarily talk about why that disclosure is there. We have some disclaimers that we can add, but we're not talking about, I guess some claims would be under the allergen area, and they would actually be different. They would fit into the claims. Something like gluten-free would be a marketing claim versus a disclosure. And so that's really what we're talking about when we look at claims, is part of that balance that we have. We're adding something to the product for a benefit. Some of the hypotheticals we've had so far, adding things like, basically dietary ingredients there to supplement and add a health benefit rather than actually have some other technical effect on the food. And that's what we're getting to when we talk about claims. So one of the things that I've wanted to emphasize through this course is we do the notification process, we do the pre-market submissions for a reason. And when we talk about the substantive areas, color additives, food additives, and the like, we're talking about a process that we must go through to avoid a finding of adulteration. If we have an unapproved food additive, we're going to find that we'll receive a notification for adulteration. Now, if we add something to the product and then we describe on the packaging why that's there on the label, on the website, and all of that, why it's there, we risk finding not necessarily an adulteration because that goes to what's in the product, but to a misbranding violation because that's what affects the label. So if we don't follow this pre-market submission process on labels, we're going to find that FDA enforcement for misbranding is an option. The FTC, which regulates advertising and marketing, very notorious for going after brands for, we'll get into some of the examples for fraudulent advertising. And so you could have the FDA come after you, the FTC come after you either together or separately. The FDA and FTC are beginning to issue joint warning letters. The warning letters come from the FDA, but they have the FDA and FTC emblems on the top, and they are signed by both the relative compliance officer level or director level of both FDA and FTC departments, and they cite both FDA and FTC law, so you could have both of those happen. Probably worse in this area is what a lot of discussion has been on in the industry for the past 5 or 10 years is the class action lawsuits for from private litigants. Typically, in this class status, because that makes the most sense and the most money. Dannon, for their probiotic digestive product that they had, $45 million lawsuit that they had. Other brands have had similar lawsuits with less sums involved, but still substantial sums and still the publicity that goes with that. And brand reputation is another reason we want to make sure that we're taking the time to do the notification process. When we're talking about the substantive submissions, we want to do that for safety. We want to make sure that we feel really confident that we're protecting our consumers and in that regard protecting the brand. But when we don't take the time to do the pre-market side for labels, we're really just setting the brand, the company up for a PR fiasco, kind of a PR nightmare that we could avoid by going through a particular process. So we'll get into a few examples of that. And one of my favorites is an example of a health claim. And a health claim is something that describes, I think we've talked about this either in this course or in Intro to Food Law, but a health claim describes a relationship of nutrient, something that's in the food product that has some evidence, we'll talk about what level of evidence in subsequent slides, to show that that has a benefit in reducing a particular disease, health condition, and the like. And Rice Krispies, as the first slide showed, this image is hidden a little bit, had the claim, now help support your child's immunity. And one of the things that, this is a pretty innocuous claim, it's a health claim, so it still has to go through this process, almost a structure function claim. But one of the things that made this claim a little more aggressive, a little more controversial, is it came out in 2009 around the time that the swine flu was catching attention in the media. Everyone was talking about protection against the swine flu. And Kellogg's either inadvertently or intentionally around this time released this revised packaging that says now help support your child's immunity, which a lot of people said that has an implication, as a context to say, and you're implying that if I eat your Rice Krispies in the morning, that my kid will be protected from swine flu. And that's an inference the FTC picked up on, and that's an inference that some class action lawsuits picked up on. Overall, what we look at on the regulatory side is that claim approved? Whether or not it has an inference to swine flu or has an inference just to general immunity, has the FDA given the approval for that claim to be made? And when we have health claims and qualified health claims, as we'll talk about, they have to be approved and they have to be substantiated. Now, if you go through the approval process, you're going to get to that substantiation as long as you're putting the appropriate disclaimers. But a lot of these claims will say clinically proven, or something to that effect, and that really suggests there's some weighty evidence behind the claim. And if it's unapproved and there isn't that clinical evidence, then you run into a lot of issues. So this isn't about citizens petition, but you can see what slide I'm recycling from. But here are some other examples of claims that were enforced against for not going through the proper process. So this was another Kellogg's product, and it actually occurred prior to the Rice Krispies issue, which the FTC was not very pleased about when it got to the Rice Krispies issue, that they had previously done an interaction with the brand about this particular issue, and then it repeated itself shortly thereafter. But the Mini Wheats product claimed, again here, clinically shown to improve kids' attentiveness, and giving a quantitative value to that 20%. And a little disclaimer here about what that clinical research is on. But the FTC took action, not the FDA, and a class action followed, and they ended up having to revise that labeling because there was no evidence to support it. I don't know why breakfast cereals are known for doing this, but a lot of these examples are breakfast cereals. Cheerios, very infamous for its focus on cholesterol, was one of the very few to receive an FDA-issued warning letter for false claims. And the FDA overall pretty relaxed in this area, and that's why you see so much class action taking and picking up the slack. But this was one example where the FDA stepped in and said, this particular claim about lowering your cholesterol 4% in 6 weeks was not substantiated in any form and was completely misleading and therefore misbranded, and issued a warning letter. And as one can imagine, that's chum in the water. And not long after the warning letter was issued, several lawsuits began, and they were all merged together in one big class action, which is not fun to deal with. This image kind of blew my mind, and this one is current to what we're talking about here, and it's marketing, not actually the product packaging. All of the examples I've shown you so far are actually product packaging, but this concept of labeling goes very far to marketing. And this was a Nestle Gerber product, their Gentle Start infant formula, and they made several claims on the packaging and their marketing about the reduction of allergies. Eat this product and your child will have a reduced likelihood of developing allergies. And this was one of the this image is one of the images that the FTC included in its evidence when it gave notice to the, Nestle and to Gerber about the violation, and very clear implication about allergies. What's interesting, and we'll talk about this example as we get into some subsequent slides, is Gerber approached the FDA for a particular health claim. The health claim was specific to a certain kind of allergen, and rather than heed that guidance that it received in that process, it expanded the claim to all allergies, which then blew its cover. So when the FTC came, it couldn't point to its FDA approval and say, well, the FDA gave us approval to say this. It actually undermined them, because when the FTC looked to what the FDA approved, it was vastly different than what they were saying, and so gave FTC even more grounds to go after them. So we're talking about approval, we're talking about the scrutiny that comes from that, and the litigation that comes for that. So these are all in the backdrop of why we do the pre-market submissions. And we talked about it with the substantive portions, looking at the ingredients and getting approval for the ingredients. We're very concerned about adulteration on that side. So if we don't do the pre-market side, we can have a finding of adulteration. Here, the consequences are magnified a little bit. We're talking only about labeling. We are talking about those ingredients that go in and why they're there, but we're talking about what's on the label. And here we don't only have the risk of regulatory action from the FTC or the FDA, but we have the very hefty penalty of a class action suit. A lot of these settle for several million, as I mentioned, the biggest being 45 million with Dannon, and that isn't always a risk we see on the other side. If someone gets sick, there's an outbreak, yes, we see settlements come out of companies at that point. But when we're talking about unapproved food additives, we're typically not talking about this scale of litigation. And so this is a particular emphasis on why we want to do our pre-market applications very carefully and make sure that we're following the guidance that comes from those. And if we're not happy with the guidance, we can take steps to try and remedy that with the agency or the courts, but we can't just ignore it. So one of the areas that we focused on, and there's only going to be two when it comes to claims. Everything else on the package is really what we just call regulatory components, and they're not necessarily claims. Another area of claims, we have three claims: health claims, nutrient content claims, and structure function claims. We're only going to talk about health claims and structure function claims. Nutrient content claims do not require notification, but they require strict application of the regulation. If it's not in the regulations, it's not a nutrient content claim you can make. You can go through the citizens petition process to attempt to get a regulation issued. The FDA isn't very open and hasn't done a lot of that, so that's typically not a route, and it's going to be a very lengthy route if it is done. So we're really just focused on health claims and structure function claims that have a pre-existing form to get approval for. So you probably have heard this acronym when talking about health claims. It's Significant Scientific Agreement, abbreviated as SSA. That is the threshold. It's a very high threshold for the health claim to meet in order for the FDA to approve it. And what you're developing a petition, and you can start to see the relationship if you're talking about a gross affirmation for a particular product that's then going to lead to labeling. You can see the relationship here, but you're going to have a petition that characterizes that relationship of the substance that has this health benefit and the disease risk that it's offering the benefit for. And that's looking at the totality of the public scientific evidence, again, as with gross affirmations and food additive petitions, looking at the good, the bad, the ugly, all of the evidence that's out there. And once we evaluate all of that evidence has to point to a significant scientific agreement that that substance has that relationship in reducing that disease or health condition. We're not asking about safety. We're not asking, should it be approved? We're asking, does the scientific community agree that that substance will aid in reducing that disease or that condition? And we can give some examples. A lot of these we're going to see on dietary supplements, which are regulated as foods. But as we see with the cereals and the Gerber, the market conditions right now really demand or push brands to make health claims on their products. You need that marketability now by having these health claims. But a lot of the examples we'll have are from supplements. So one of the great ones is calcium and its relationship to osteoporosis. And so you could have a claim that comes out that says adequate calcium throughout life as part of a well-balanced diet may reduce the risk of osteoporosis. And that's the health part of the relationship health part of it, may reduce the risk. And you'll notice these are given a CFR number in section 101. Health claims result in the issuance of a regulation. So that provides support not only for your particular petition, but if others want to come through and make that similar claim because they have that identical ingredient, that identical substance at that level, they can come through and use that. And also the regulation will give you coverage when the FTC comes and tries to take enforcement, or a private litigant comes to take enforcement. You can point to the regulation and say we're in compliance with 21 CFR 101 point, whatever the case will be. So that gives you a sense of health claims. And under an interim guidance right now, and we'll see if this survives, we have a qualified health claim. And what the FDA came to do is there is some substances that are either new or the scientific study of it is new, and so we have some emerging evidence. We don't have a scientific consensus. We don't have a significant scientific agreement about the substance and the relationship to reduced risk for a disease or health condition, but we have some inklings that that's going to happen. And there's different levels provided in the guidance document that can apply. So if you have very weak evidence, moderate evidence, and what's considered a higher qualified evidence, you can select what level of evidence you're going for, and then there's a corresponding disclaimer to that particular level of evidence, of support. So we're not having to meet this higher threshold. It's a little less rigorous, but we are adding that disclaimer. And if you look at the Gerber example, this kind of briefly summarizes it. They've essentially told them they could use the qualified health claim for this whey protein in reducing the risk of atopic dermatitis, but they had to include the disclaimer that there was little scientific evidence for this relationship. And it's actually much more detailed what the FDA gave Gerber. Interestingly enough, if you put in Gerber atopic dermatitis into a search engine, you'll get Gerber has a whole FAQ webpage dedicated to their petition. And interestingly enough, you have to agree that you're a medical professional to access the website. But if you go there, you can also find it in the FDA materials on their website. The FDA actually provided 4 fully modeled claims that Gerber could choose to use for this relationship in this particular substance. And that's fairly common. You're going to submit a petition with some desired claims, and you're going to submit the petition stating what type of scientific evidence, what type of disclaimer will be appropriate, and your support for that level of evidence. The FDA will come back and provide, typically not a yes or a no, but will provide model claims for what can be used, both for qualified health claims and health claims. Very common for the FDA to provide at least 2 model claims, if not in some cases up to 4 or 5. Structure function claims are tantalizing, they're exciting, they're used on supplements a ton. If you take any dietary supplements, or if you walk down the aisle of the grocery store that has the supplements in it, you can pick out structure function claims all day. Those products are full of them. And they state a specific relationship to how this nutrient triggers something in the body, the structure function of the body. Calcium builds strong bones, and we're moving away from this supports may reduce the risk of, which we see in health claims or qualified health claims, to an action, building strong bones. And there's a whole rule that's issued on structure function claims that applies to supplements. As mentioned, huge pressure on the market now to have more of this marketability, and we're seeing structure function claims come over to conventional food products. That rule doesn't necessarily apply directly. It's issued under DSHEA and not directly applicable to conventional foods, but we can use it as a model for what are the tripwires for going into new drug status, reclassification as a drug product, which of course we want to avoid. So that rule is persuasive and helpful, but excuse me, be mindful that we're not going to be able to cite to that rule for conventional food products. For dietary supplements, there is a notification requirement, again tied to DSHEA, tied to the structure function rule, that requires notification 30 days after first making the claim on the product. So this is different than what we see, on health claims, where we're actually, before we're able to use the health claim, we're having to submit a petition requesting permission to use the claim, and then in most cases receiving model claims back. Here in the supplement area, we're actually making the claim on the product, begin marketing, and within 30 days of having the product on the market, we submit a notification to the FDA saying, by the way, we're using this structure function claim pursuant to this rule, and so forth, and providing the support for that. Again, we don't have that in conventional food. So if we're making a structure function claim, it's more of a description of what we're doing and less of a regulation of what we are following. And so if we're doing a structure function on a conventional food, no notification requirement. We can put it on the product, and the only time we'll have to be concerned about it is if there's an enforcement action by the FDA or if the FTC comes with particular questions. Otherwise, we're free to use it. I mentioned that structure function claims are tantalizing. I think it's because it gets so close to this medicinal aspect of what a nutrient can do, and we are in a market that's really focused on natural remedies, homeopathic remedies, traditional medicine, and so we want to see food as medicine, which is fine, and that's great. But when we get to that line in our regulatory world, food and medicine are separate. And for the most part, our food products do not want to be medicine because that's a huge regulatory burden that we don't want to hit. So our food needs to get as close to that line in our labeling and in our description of it. We're talking about chia seed, or we're talking about wheatgrass, or we're talking about all these different products that are in the market that are foods. They're traditionally eaten as foods, but they have this great health benefit. The labeling gets as close as it can, typically through structure function, in large part because we don't have to have pre-approval. And that's what makes them so tantalizing. We can make the claim and send a notice to the FDA. Of course, if you send a notice to the FDA on a supplement saying, this product will kill tumors, you're going to get some FDA attention. But for the most part, if you're sticking into this pre-approved model, you're going to be fine. And that's what makes these claims so appealing, and also what makes them so tantalizing. So be careful with this type of claim. Now we're going to move into registration, and you'll notice that everything we've talked about is FDA related and nothing USDA related. All of these type of claims are available in the USDA FSIS realm. It's just such a different labeling process on that side. It's not worth getting into. If you have to go through the FSIS labeling process, very regimented. All of the labels are pre-approved before released, so that means all the claims are going to be reviewed before release. And there's two methods that you can go through for FSIS pre-approval. There's generic approvals and sketch approvals, and different aspects related to those. So if you have a meat product or RTE type product that's regulated by the FSIS, be aware that there is going to be some ability to talk about these claims. Again, cognizant of our very early discussion in this course and in Intro to Law about classifying FDA and USDA, because you're going to want to know, do you have to go through that regimented pre-approval process or the FDA permissive process? So we're not going to talk about that in a lot of detail, but I want to let you know why we're not doing that. So if you are an FDA regulated facility, Again, you're not having to get a grant of inspection through the USDA and have USDA inspectors in your facility, but we're talking about FDA regulated food facility. We go through a registration process, and it used to be register and forget it. I mean, I had clients that couldn't remember if they had registered because they'd done it so long ago, and we had to go through and just re-register. FSMA changed that. Food Safety Modernization Act changed that, and now we're required to do biannual registration. Registration is really an administrative function. It is pre-market. On the pre-market side, it has to be done, must be done before entering the market for both foreign and domestic facilities. I recommend the electronic system. Its abbreviation is FURLS, F-U-R-L-S, and you log in and you can get your registration done and get that process initiated a little faster than the paper form. The FDA is moving away from paper for the most part, and the registration, establishment registration process for medical device and drug has eliminated the paper registration possibility. It's all electronic. On the food side, you can still find the FDA form for food facility registration, complete it by hand and mail it in. I'm not sure how long that will last, but it's still an option. There are certain activities that will trigger registration requirements. And so when we look at how many food facilities are registered, the number seems pretty massive, but it's actually not capturing a lot of information that, because of these activities, don't have to be caught. So for example, if you have a foreign manufacturer in South Korea that makes a packaged food item that contains 5 ingredients, and it's a supplier of those 5 ingredients does no other exports. They solely send those 5 ingredients to the South Korean manufacturer, who then exports to the US. We're not capturing that supplier in this registration process. We're only capturing the foreign manufacturer who exports to the US. So manufacturing, relabeling, domestic distribution, there's some other activities. They get caught in the registration system. If you look at the paper form, because you don't have to create an account to log in and see all these options and go through those steps, if you download the paper form, you'll see what those activities are in the range of food products that they apply to. There's a different registration process for low acid canned foods and acidified foods than the rest of the registration process, but otherwise we're all going to go through this FURLS process. As mentioned, it's required for any time you're going to interact with the agency. That's going to be something they're going to look for, and so it's absolutely required before you start the sale of product, but you're going to want to have that registration before you start any interaction on the pre-market side. So if you're thinking about doing pre-market side before entering the market, you don't have any product on the market, you should still register before interacting with the agency. And I recommend that in large part because there's no filing fee. Look at drug facilities, look at medical device facilities. There's a lot of user fees on those products, not as heavy on the food side, and in particular no filing fee for the establishment registration. Again, biannual, and if you're not familiar with the FDA fiscal year, the fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th, and so if we're always kind of a fiscal year ahead, so it's already going to be fiscal year 2015 for the FDA, and their fiscal year will start a little earlier. So that means your registration will be valid by fiscal year and not by calendar year. And so with the FDA will send email reminders to renew the registration, but renewals must occur when that new fiscal year begins. October 1st is when the new fiscal year begins, and they require that it be done before December 31st. If it's not done by then, it's assumed to be an abandoned registration, and you will have to go through a different process. And again, this is biannual, so it's on even years. So 2014 is a renewal year, and so facilities have October 1st to December 31st of 2014 to renew their registrations and stay in compliance in that regard. Highly administrative function. It's one of those things that just has to be done, and it's important that it doesn't get overlooked and cause some issues, but that's registrations in a nutshell. So what we'll do for the last week is presentations with potentially a small lecture to supplement that as well, but otherwise we pretty much have talked about all of these submissions, and we'll look forward to reading the final research assignments.